All right, we finally made it here. The moment that we've all been waiting for, or dreading, or are indifferent about. The election of 1860, which is the catalyst for the American Civil War. So, in the election of 1860, there was pretty significant nomination issues again that led to problems and conflict because, quite frankly, as we looked at, like regionally, the country was somewhat tearing itself apart. And for the Republican Party, this was not as big of a deal because the Republican Party was drawing all of their support from the North. But for the Democrats, much bigger issue. So the Democratic Party is going to formally split after the Northern Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas, who, as you remember from previous lectures, outraged Southerners with his Freeport doctrine. The Democratic Party is going to blow up the same way the Whig Party blew up into Northern and Southern wings, and that's going to have predictable results, as we've seen multiple times throughout history up to this point. So, Democratic Party's gone, which is going to give a huge advantage to the Republicans. In this charming political cartoon, the Democrats are represented by two opossums with the same tail. And as you can see, our Republican, Abraham Lincoln, has got them caught in a rail tie representing his common man roots. So, exciting. In this one, the Democrats are pulling a cart in two directions as the Lincoln train is coming down the tracks, so a little bit more explicit there. And the Republican nomination is much easier because it's going to go to Abraham Lincoln, and he's going to be the standard bearer from the party going forward. Lincoln, here we see him rushing to the White House with a split rail again, because Lincoln's campaign organized sort of this grassroots movement to try to get out the vote and to both get people registered and voting and intimidate sort of critics. This organization was known as the Wide Awakes, which is represented by this terrifying unblinking eye. And they also wore this uniform, like we saw Lincoln wearing in the last picture, where they had this cap and sort of a long white cloak, which, yeah, looks really creepy, but that's for reasons that are going to become important later. So they would hold mass rallies supporting Lincoln. Here we can see them with their white cloaks. They also served as like sort of an unofficial bodyguard, trying to shield him in public appearances. And they would, of course, also intimidate rivals and participate in the type of voter fraud that was very common in elections in the 1800s. So Lincoln's organization was known as the Wide Awakes, and they were able to mobilize Northern support for the candidate because, of course, since he's a Republican candidate, he's going to have zero support in the South. The Republican platform is pretty straightforward. We've sort of laid out the Republican principles, but by 60, they've got it pretty clearly down. So all of these different things, you don't need to necessarily memorize all these things, but you've got the no expansion of slavery, you've got the protective tariff, you've got the infrastructure, internal improvements, homesteads for farmers. Down at the bottom, you see that. The Homestead Act was one of the pieces of the Republican platform. And they're not going to have a nativist plank of the platform. And so this is going to mean all the know-nothings are going to start voting Democrat, or the know-nothings would be tempted to vote Democratic, but the Democrats are also a pro-immigrant, pro-Irish party, or more pro-immigrant, pro-Irish. And so if your main issue is that you don't want immigrants coming into the country, in 1860 you didn't really have a candidate. So make it as simple as possible. No expansion of slavery. You'll notice there's nothing in there about specific abolition. So the Republicans were not yet abolitionists yet, or at least their official platform did not have an abolitionist plank. But you've got the no expansion of slavery, and you've got the sort of American System 2.0, and homesteads. For Southerners, they really tried to paint the Republicans as a pro-African American platform. And so you can see this political cartoonist is showing an African American hidden under the Republican platform, implying that if the Republicans got elected, they would pursue equal rights or abolition, despite the fact that that was not specifically in their platform. In the end, the results are about what you'd expect. I'll give you just a moment to sort of look over this, but it's pretty straightforward. The Democrats splitting the vote means that they lose. You notice that John C. Breckinridge is the Southern Democratic candidate. So and he would of course win most of the South. Stephen Douglas only won one state, the state of Missouri, but he pulled a lot of votes from the North, and you can see he got almost 30% of the vote. Bell was a part of what's called the Unionist Party, which was a party that just wanted to basically ignore all the issues associated with slavery in order to keep the Union together. And the states there are the main border states where the war would be fought if it happened. So it makes sense that someone whose main platform is, come on guys, please let's not have a civil war, would get votes in those border states. And of course, Lincoln would win all of the North, which when you look at the number of states and the size, it doesn't seem that impressive. But as we remember, the population of the North has been significantly outstripping the population of the South. And so now you can clearly win an election with only Northern support and no Southern support. And one of the most galling things to Southerners is the Southern ballots, Lincoln really didn't even run in the South. He was not on any of the Southern ballots, which means that the President of the United States, if you lived in one of these deep South states, was elected who you didn't vote for and wasn't even on your ballot. And so clearly the South was starting to feel like they were not represented, or they were much less influential than they could have been. So the election of 1860 now gives us Abraham Lincoln, and this is the direct catalyst for secession. Secession was a process that happened somewhat gradually. Unsurprisingly, South Carolina is the first state to secede, and all the southern states were sort of talking about it, but South Carolina just basically jumped out on their own, and then the rest of the deep South sort of jumped out, and then other states had sort of conventions to figure out whether or not they wanted to secede, and then eventually obviously all of the states that would become Confederate states did. But it's important to note that secession was not universally popular throughout the South, and there were significant portions of a number of even deep Southern states that voted against it. Most notably, you can see that the backcountry of Virginia didn't support secession, and you can basically see the shape of the Appalachian Mountains going down south there across sort of the southern states, and obviously the main issue being slavery. And so the areas where it was predominantly small white farmers living, subsistence, yeoman farmers, just who didn't own slaves, they were very sort of lukewarm about the whole cause. And although eventually a lot of them would go fight, they were not as committed to secession, at least at the beginning. So that's the secession vote. South Carolina goes out first, then the rest of these states go out. But yeah, and so here's the Union being dissolved, sort of, although, of course, you can declare independence whenever you want. I mean, we talked about this with the American Revolution. Anyone can declare independence, but if your independence isn't recognized by the people you're declaring independence from, clearly it's not going anywhere. And the North, despite the fact that the South argued that they're out, the North argued that, one, you can't be out, and two, we're not going to let you leave, right, because it's illegal. And so the independence of the South was not recognized by the North. There was one last sort of gasp to put the Union back together, one last effort by Senator Crittenden of Tennessee, and he proposed this groundbreaking plan. What if there was this line going across the country, and above that line would be closed to slavery, and below that line, slavery would be allowed? And we could just pick an arbitrary parallel, maybe 3630 right under Missouri. And so Crittenden tried to pull out the Missouri Compromise and dust it off one last time. But at this point, there's basically a full-on civil war going on in Kansas. The Supreme Court has ruled that slaves can be brought everywhere, and senators are being beaten up on the floor of the Senate. And so this clearly did not fly for either side, and war would be inevitable. The war itself started with the attack on Fort Sumter. And this is sometimes hard to understand, but when the South claims to have seceded, there's a choice that has to be made for basically every American, right? And so South Carolina seceded, but the American troops in Fort Sumter off the coast of South Carolina did not secede. And so now you've got this Union military base sitting on the coast right near South Carolina. And so yeah, there's Fort Sumter. And so the question is, okay, there's just sort of this standoff for a little while after secession had happened, but before the war had started. And so the South basically blockaded the fort, and the North was was going to send down a relief force in order to reinforce and resupply the fort. And there was this question of like, okay, well, who's going to start firing first? And so in the end, the South started firing first, attacked the fort, and the fort, realizing that relief would not get there in time, surrendered. And so the South seized Fort Sumter, and of course seized all of that sort of U.S. military gear that James Buchanan had been like surreptitiously sending south. And the Civil War would begin. Here's the battery of Fort Sumter, which honestly was not as effective as simply the starving it out and the fact that the relief force was not able to get there. Here's Fort Sumter being shelled again. Of course, not every slave state left the Union, which is also somewhat confusing. A lot of the border states were very strategically important to the North, and so a lot of them were kept into the Union for a variety of different reasons. As you can see here, obviously Maryland is somewhat important, considering considering the capital is in between Maryland and Virginia, and so if Maryland secedes, then the U.S. capital is fully in Southern territory. Kentucky was also really important because it shares sort of the border of the Ohio River, and Missouri was important for control over the Mississippi River. And so all of these states stayed in for a variety of different reasons. And within a lot of these states, there were both pro-Confederates and pro-Union forces, and oftentimes you got these sort of irregular militia units, which would then fight it out, sort of Bleeding Kansas style throughout the frontier of the border states. And so the Union, of course, would want to hold on to these states, and the South is, of course, trying to make it very difficult for the Union to operate there. And so in Missouri, it was mainly German settlers who were very much more anti-slavery, who kept Germany, or who kept Missouri in the Union. In Maryland, it was honestly the Union Army. Because it was so important and they didn't want the South to sort of surround the capital, federal troops occupied most of Maryland. Baltimore had to be placed under martial law several times. Pro-Southern mobs would attack Union soldiers as they traveled through Baltimore, and Maryland was basically just occupied from the beginning, as was Kentucky. And so the Confederate States of America are only the southern states that seceded, and we, of course, have noted that not all slave states seceded, and so there were slave states in the Union, which is going to become somewhat complicated once we get to sort of the whole Emancipation Proclamation thing. And so it was set up as a Confederate republic, sort of like the Articles of Confederation. And so they're of course not going to have a strong government model. And it was set up based on the principle of white supremacy. And so this is the what's known as the cornerstone speech by Alex Stevens. And its idea is pretty simple. The idea that slavery is good for black people, and that that black people are not equal to white people. And so this is the document that whenever someone tries to claim that like the South wasn't really about white supremacy or it was about states' rights or something else, you can sort of, you pull out the Alex Stevens cornerstone speech and it becomes much harder to make that argument. So cornerstone speech by Alex Stevens, yeah. And of course, the southern states, it was one of the things that made it difficult to fight a war is because since most of the power was held by the states, the central government had a lot of trouble sort of compelling them to do the things that they wanted to do. Very similar to how the Articles of Confederation government struggled to compel the states when it came time to, fight the British or a variety of other things. And so the southern states are going to go their own way a lot of the time. They're going to sometimes ignore the central government. And so it really did take a quite skilled administrator to be able to pull all of this together. And so the president of the Confederacy was Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, and he is going to be the commander-in-chief of the Confederate States of America. Here's Jeff Davis, and he is going to be the one to sort of hold together these disparate states in the face of really, really difficult circumstances. So Jeff Davis. The, the two sides were obviously not equal. The North had some pretty significant advantages over the South. Obviously, troop strength is a big one. The population of the North is way larger than the population of the South. And so throughout basically the entire war, the North is going to outnumber the South at least 2-to-1 and sometimes 3-to-1 and more. And so the North is going to have significantly more troops than the South is going to have. They're also going to have almost all of the manufacturing capacity of the country. We had talked earlier during the sectionalism lecture about how the South was still primarily agrarian, which is really problematic if you're trying to outfit a modern army, which the Civil War was in a very real way the first sort of modern war the U.S. fought, where you have to produce ridiculous amounts of ammunition and rifles and clothing and all of this other stuff, and outfit a massive modern army. And so the North is going to have a huge advantage there. And the North had almost all of the railroads, which is really problematic because the South's railroads it was pretty easy to take one rail junction. Like if you cut the rail line through Tennessee, all of a sudden getting anything out to Mississippi is basically impossible. And so that's really problematic for the South. And of course, firearm production, as you can see here, population. The South, they've got 29% of the population, but that's like 3.5 million enslaved people as well. And so that's not going to be super helpful. And of course, yeah, they had a significant advantage in bales of cotton at the beginning of the war. But of course, the Northern blockade is quickly going to take that advantage away. As we said, on paper, it looks like the North has a lot of advantages, but the South has some advantages too, and they ended up being somewhat important. Obviously, the North is going to have to invade the South, which means the South is going to be fighting on familiar territory, and so they're going to be able to use the sort of local population and as an advantage as well. And the North supply lines are going to be much longer. The South also has almost all of the best military generals. The South has a much stronger tradition of military service than the North has, and therefore most of the officer corps, or a lot of the officer corps, was Southern, and therefore people like Robert E. Lee are going to make a big difference, because the North is going to struggle to find competent military leaders, whereas the South is going to have a lot of them. And honestly, some of it is simply motivation. The South has to outlast the North. And the South has a real sense of, they really try to tie their struggle to the American Revolution, to fight for freedom and states' rights, ironically, because, of course, they're fighting also to continue to enslave people. So the South also is going to have that sort of motivation on their side. And it's really not until the North sort of changes their motivation for the war from keeping the Union together to making it about slavery that they're able to also sort of get that moral high ground, which is really important when you're fighting a war that's going to be as long and brutal as the Civil War. And so those are the basic sides, the basic strengths of both sides, and the basic path that we got to secession. So we'll start getting into the real battles next time, and we'll try to cover the eastern part and the beginning sort of the Civil War.